Now we rendered this with the Eevee render engine, and we have another render engine within Blender called Cycles, which will actually give a more realistic lighting result. So to compare the two images, we can actually load up two images within this viewer. We have what are called slots up at the top here. We're currently in slot 1. If I change to slot 2, when we render a new image, it will appear here, and we'll be able to flip between the two. For now, leave it selected on slot 2 and close this viewer. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go into the render properties, and we're going to change this render engine from Eevee to Cycles. When we do that, you'll be able to see that this viewport changes quite a bit. We have this very noisy image, which takes a little time to resolve. And that's because the render engine works differently. It takes a lot longer to render something with the Cycles render engine, but you'll get far nicer end results. Obviously, this finished rendered image is still very noisy, and the reason for that is the viewport samples here are set relatively low at 32. Our default render samples are 128, which will give us a far more detailed result. But in addition to that, even at 128 samples, we may end up with a lot of noise in our shadows. So to get around that, we have a feature called denoising. If I open up this little drop down here, we can enable denoising for our rendered result or for our viewport. For now, I'm going to leave the viewport as it is and just enable it in the render. I'm also going to reduce the number of render samples from 128 to just 64. So that will give us more samples than our viewport, but still hopefully sufficient to get a smooth result once we have the denoising enabled. Now to see the end result, as before, we can simply pick Render Image from the render menu or hit F12. Now we can see our image rendering, and this will take a lot longer than our Eevee render. You can see as the process goes that we have a noisy image, and then the denoiser runs over the top and smooths out that noisy image. Now, depending on the power of your computer, this may take quite a while to render, or it might be relatively quick. So just give this a couple of minutes, and we'll see an end result. And there we have our finished rendered image. So if you want to compare the two, we can jump between slot 1 and slot 2. And to do that, you can also use the number 1 and 2 keys on your keyboard. So I think it's fairly obvious that this our Eevee render is a lot darker in the shadows, whereas the Cycles render has a lot more bounce light, which is filling in those shadows nicely. The colors are bleeding into one another and overall creates a far more pleasing image. So obviously we have a trade-off here between an image that renders almost instantly, one that takes a lot longer, but looks a lot better. So again, we can go up to our image menu, click Save As, and save this image out. So because we saved our last image as test render 1, we can just hit this little plus icon and save it out as test render 2 and close the viewer.